Because this is a public space, it's a public building, so it requires certain kind of maintenance for it to exist for, XYZ number of years. So 20 years since the inauguration or the placement of this mural, it suddenly brought down without informing the artist. And this is happening around 1979. And the artist is still alive, and the artist is not informed, and it's tucked away in one of the lobbies or the storehouse without informing the artist. So the artwork is kind of brought down, and the artist actually takes the government to court.
Oh, wow. Welcome to this episode where we discuss art in public spaces, the legacy of or the lack of, which is a research paper that is part of Zinnov Foundation's initiative of, getting into the nuances of research related to art in public spaces. This is something that we initiated in October of 2025, and we announced an open call where we received a phenomenal response, of course. And today we have with us the winner, Shatavisha Mustafi, whose paper dwells on the aspect of art in public spaces, specifically the legacy or the lack of it. Welcome, Shatavisha. Your paper was fantastic because it explored the nuances of, the legacy of art in public spaces, or rather the lack of, through a very fantastic example. I think today for our audiences, what we want to do is kind of unravel it, and if you could just talk about it and tell us what constitutes, the whole initiative of art in public spaces. And my first question to you is, because we are focusing on post-independence, right? So immediately, what was kind of taking place in the landscape of the whole idea of bringing in art into public spaces? What were the impulses, or what was the perspective through which this entire idea of incorporating art began?
Thank you very much. I am truly honored to having received the award and the warm hospitality. Now, moving on to the question, right after independence, what we can see that there is a lot of tension when it comes to the cultural spheres and how to get artists employed. So for musicians, we have the All India Radio taking care of it. Even for writers, certain aspects, there are novels, cinema also comes about. So the writers are also in a way taken care of. Now, when it comes to acquiring of artworks, particularly by artists, professionally trained artists, it's expensive, and it was not essentially possible for the masses to have that kind of funds to acquire artworks. So therefore the government steps in, and it's been decided that what if we appropriate existing colonial period buildings with artworks by Indian artists? And along the same time, because literally the process of nation building is happening, if we have new buildings, we have artists intervening these spaces, interacting and creating public art projects. And for this, it was tabled in one of the cabinet's meeting that a certain portion of the money required in the construction of these public buildings would be dedicated towards, creating an artwork. So it was kind of divided, as it's reflected in my paper, that, if you have 2.5%, 1.5%, and 0.5%, depending on the total expenditure that one spends on a particular public building, so that we have these modernist artists employed. And in terms of funding that the artists receive, so they did receive a little bit of money for their intellectual thinking process, as well as the cost or the expenditure of, or something that in contemporary terms we call for the production budget.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. So it's basically, I think it was quite interesting that they, right at the outset, identified that there is something that goes into the making of it, and there is an artist fee or a conceptual fee, that comes in. Please go ahead.
And this resulted in several public buildings, primarily because, New Delhi was the capital city, or is the capital city. Therefore, several public buildings that dots the landscape even till date. We have from the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India building, which is flanked by the Yaksha and the Yakshi.
By Ram Kinkar.
By Ram Kinkar, yes, of course. And then you also have the High Court mural by Satish Gujral, so on and so forth. However, this was not limited to Delhi. Other places or other states also witness public art project. Mumbai as well as Chennai. So there are also around the 50s, there are several public art projects. The triumph of labor, which is right now at the Marina Beach, that also comes about slightly later in the 60s, but the conceptualization happens around that time.
Yeah. Also, to be more specific, most of these are in seats of power. Like, the Rashtrapati Bhavan will have the murals, or in Mumbai it was, I think the Vidhan Sabha, which had these murals kind of coming in. Which brings me to my next question to you, which again, you talk beautifully in your paper. Also, just for the benefit of our audiences, the paper is available on Zinnov Foundation's website for everybody to come read it or even download it. So, it's there for everybody to look at in detail. But coming back to you, Shatavisha, I think what we can discuss over here is this whole aspect of artist's vision and the body that's kind of commissioning it. How are artists kind of negotiating that concept or the problem when it comes to doing these, and of course the scale also, which is important here because they're larger buildings. So if you could just talk about that through an example, I think, which is there in your paper, I think that would be great.
So first of all, when the initiative was being conceptualized, they got the Lalit Kala involved, and there were artists who were on the advisory boards along with bureaucrats who also understood the entire vision in terms of the necessity to have public art project and what it does to the sensibility of the citizen, of the larger citizen of the country. One example that I would like to highlight, which I also mentioned in the paper, is the Vigyan Bhavan mural. So the idea that I got stems from Rebecca Brown's interaction with the architectural space. But what got me interested is that it's not just the Chaitya arches that are exciting, but also what happened inside this building. So this was a conference, a very important conference venue hosting world delegates. So it was carefully envisioned that, you not only have a Chaitya arch representing all possible sensibilities, but also in terms of when this particular artist I will talk about receive the commission, what they do with that particular space. And we have the artist Amarnath Saigal. He was he was commissioned to do this massive mural, bronze mural, highlighting the agrarian, or rather a tribute to the agrarian communities of India. So we have, at one hand, it talks about certain understanding of the labor force, but what becomes exciting in this particular mural is how technology has been showed. So you have farmers winnowing on one side, and you also have tractors on the other side, highlighting, the tech aspects of agriculture. You also have a tiny aeroplane, which also highlights, certain aspects of modernism, which becomes extremely exciting. And in a way, when you have a conference venue highlighting pastoral or agricultural society or labor force, including, and Saigal is extremely sensitive when it also comes to the gendered understanding of labor. So you have male as well as female farmers depicting and, deeply invested in this crop. So again, crop cultivation. So again, when it comes to the other thing that I tried to sort of highlight is what kind of crops are being sort of harvested. So you have, and because it's winnowing, so we know is most likely rice or wheat. And in the 60s, we know the entire stress that of course comes much later, gets reflected much later. So we also have the Green Revolution. So this is also the time when films like Mother India is being released, which sort of highlights the tech, agricultural land, the figure of the mother earth that it also refers to. So all these kind of goes in the conceptualization of this massive mural.
So this, it's interesting that you're talking about, or the artist has been picking up on all these things. And if we were to just go back a little, so you're talking about Vigyan Bhavan, which is in Delhi, and which is also a venue for conferences. And there's an exterior of it, which, you mentioned, which is Chaitya, which is a Buddhist, architectural form. So there's a contrast that we kind of see within what is the outside of the building and what is happening in the interior space of it. We have this fantastic thing, and but then what happens? Because when we talk about legacy, does this still continue? I mean, how do we access this information, and what happens actually, to the mural? Because that becomes another interesting aspect of the whole large-scale mural, which is one on the inside of this particular space. So if you could just, talk about that, because legacy implies many things. So how is it that you've dealt, or how is it that you've looked at this particular aspect?
Well, thank you for the question, because this is where the problem starts. Because this is a public space, it's a public building, so it requires certain kind of maintenance for it to exist for, XYZ number of years. So 20 years since the inauguration or the placement of this mural, it suddenly brought down without informing the artist. And this is happening around 1979. And the artist is still alive, and the artist is not informed, and it's tucked away in one of the lobbies or the storehouse without informing the artist. And it's here when I say that even the initiative that was that gave place and space for so many ideas to exist and coexist, that had its own shortcoming, because it talks about employing the artist, it talks about creating public art projects, but it doesn't talk about the afterlife or what happens when governments change, what happens when, you also, this is a public building, so you have to have certain kind of maintenance. This is also a bronze mural, so there would be wear and tear. So it doesn't talk about these factors. It doesn't factor things like this. Also, not a budget is allocated that the care that goes into maintaining a public art project. Coming back to Sehgal, so the artwork is kind of brought down, and the artist actually takes the government to court.
Oh, wow. That's unusual.
Yes. So he claims that he had written, and this was his last resort, because he has written several letters, and these letters are wonderfully archived at the Amarnath Sehgal archives, and I had access to look at these documents. So he said that this was his last resort. He didn't want to essentially drag something like this, because he was part of several other projects as well.
And I was just going to kind of come to that, because, for our audiences also it's important to know that the artists that we are talking about are artists who are established within the art ecosystem.
Yes.
And they're doing, similar projects, or, not in that scale possibly, but their works are being kind of incorporated in the visual landscape of not only New Delhi, but in case of Amarnath Sehgal, it was also in Chandigarh, and also internationally. He had a few in Europe itself. So these are artists who are well aware of what is permissible and how things need to coexist. And that's where it starts getting interesting. And then if you could kind of, take us through the entire process of it?
The legal battle drags for 13 long years.
Oh my God.
Yes. And here was this artist, all that he was saying that I was not notified, and maybe perhaps given, the stature of this artist, he could have intervened, opted for solution, or rather get in dialogue primarily. I mean, for starters, to resolve this. He was claiming that he didn't have any information, and in a way, for an artist, it's disrespectful to be written off. Suddenly, here you are being celebrated, being part of such an essential building, being available for the world to kind of discuss and discourse, and suddenly you are you're written off. So that bit. So there was sentimental thoughts as well as legal, and it was a copyright suit that he filed, and this battle went on for 13 years. Simply because the grit and the willpower that something like this, and it also sets a precedent for future artworks if they fall in the same kind of tension, then what happens? So after much sort of, and one can imagine 13 years is a lot of time of conversation, dialogues. And again, these are documents which are all available, which I consulted while drafting this paper. So, and finally, guess what? Sehgal wins the long battle, and he's been awarded compensation of 5 lakhs as well as 9% interest. All of that happens. But what is also extremely poetic is that the artwork is still tucked away. And we don't get to see it anymore, or perhaps never, rather, because, such a massive installation, it was part of a public discourse. Putting it even in a private space, it doesn't create the same kind of impact that Sehgal was trying to initiate.
Yeah. So I think, that's where the rejoinder to the topic, which is the legacy or the lack of. I mean, here the artist has fought for his rights, has made sure that there is a notice that is taken of what he's trying to say, because I don't think it was only about monetary compensation. It was more about what is permissible and the engagement or the involvement of the artist in what happens to the work subsequent to it being removed from its original intended space. But what I find more painful is that it still is not seen. Right. And then how do you deal with it? And I think these are open-ended questions, because there isn't a defined way to deal with it. There can be, because, the legacy part of it is usually we understand as something that you continue to see or you continue to engage with. But here the legacy now comes into a different realm, which is a legacy of process, a legacy of, how do you ensure that what is commissioned also continues. So the legacy of policy is also something that needs to be addressed. So while the paper, or I don't think anybody of us will have an immediate solution, but it's an important question that you bring up and you address it. And I think that as a foundation where we're trying to bring in art into public spaces and in a thoughtful manner, this becomes an important aspect. And I think that's why, these are landmark cases, and we need to have enough visibility that is given to all of these things that's happening. Anything else that you want to kind of add in, which, maybe as I think outside of the paper that because, it's an academic paper and you've gone through it. Any interesting information that you want to talk about that you came across, while you were reading, or conversations that you had?
So first of all, again, quickly, so what I found extremely interesting is how, even though it was a copyright case, it was filed or fought against the lines of moral rights, and that the moral right of any artwork will always belong to the artist, and it doesn't matter who commissions. So in a way, the case, I think, champions the cause of artists more than taking aside with that of any form of ruling government, or whosoever for that matter is the body or agency funding that particular project. So in a way, this becomes a landmark case in multiple ways, and we are yet to see public art facing similar kind of conditions. You have the existing ones from the 50s are kind of being carried on, but many of them are not essentially in the right sort of, are under threat, I would say, simply because there is a wear and tear situation, and most of these artists no longer survive. It was really lucky that Amarnath Sehgal was back then alive to even file and fight for his artwork or their artwork, but I doubt if a similar instance happens with existing public artwork where the artist is no longer alive. Then the question is, who is the custodian? Or then as general public, do we step in as this is also part of our shared history? So do we step in, intervene, or let things sort of disintegrate or with time? So that is a philosophical question. How do we create more spaces for more public art projects to come about? So that I think.
I think, you brought it to a point where I wanted to kind of, it fits in with what, we as a foundation are taking baby steps into and initiating. That's the whole idea of initiating a research cell, is identifying such cases, raising awareness and trying to find direction. There is a case, I would like to kind of bring up, which is in Mumbai, which has happened in Mumbai in the past decade or so, where there was a work of Pilu Poch Khanwala that was a landmark installation in front of what is now the CSM VS Museum, or opposite the police headquarters, or opposite Metro Regal Cinema, which had to be removed to make way for another sculpture that has come into its place, which is fine. As the city evolves, there's a different aspiration that comes in. But there has been a lot of, or at least initially, there was a lot of questioning and media reports on where is the sculpture. And now again, nobody knows where it is, or rather they say it is there in storage, but what happens to it? So it's not only one instance. I mean, this becomes a documented case. And like you rightly said, the artist was there at that time to kind of take it up. Here, this is where, when we talk about art in public spaces, the public needs to kind of come in and take up the cause, figure out ways. And these are important questions, because one is, how do you commission? How do you ensure that what goes in is responsive to the community, the space, and then the afterlife of the work, which then constitutes into legacy? These are all painful questions with no 100% solutions, at least now. But at least it's a conversation that I think we need to have enough of. And I would urge all our listeners and people who are tuning in to have a read of the paper that Shatavisha has so carefully and thoughtfully kind of put together, and keep and send us your feedback, any kind of direction that comes in, because it's like I said, there isn't a solution, there isn't a conclusion, it's a process and it's a journey. And that's where, our research cell kind of comes into play to have more conversations. Thank you, viewers, for joining in, listening into our conversation. And thank you, Shatavisha, for being part of this conversation. And again, your paper was something that was so appropriate. And obviously, that's how you've been the winner for it. So thank you for being part of this conversation and being part of Zinnov Foundation's journey into research and having this conversation with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.